It's very easy to romanticize the idea that someone just stuck it out, and aren't they so great? Not necessarily. Instead of glorifying the stick it out, let's recognize the sacrifices that some of these folks made, the limitations that they faced. But let's not ever try to view suffering and abuse through an idealized lens. How many of you, when you talk about or reflected on the history of narcissistic abuse you experienced, particularly if it happened when you were a kid, how many of you were told that that really bad treatment you received was good for you? Let's take that on. Can really feel galling to hear someone say that something that hurt you so bad could have been good for you. Because, again, drop in the comments how many of you have been heard or been told that all the meanness, cruelty, awfulness, or even abuse of a narcissistic relationship, that it was somehow good for you. It's terrible to consider, but yes, some people, they believe it, they certainly say it, that the abuse of a narcissistic relationship, things like, well, you're still standing, so it couldn't have been that bad for you, or, oh, come on, it wasn't that bad for you, it gave you a stronger back, a thicker skin, it gave you character. I call BS on that. I don't think there is ever a scenario in which being invalidated, manipulated, or gaslighted is good. I just don't. It doesn't build character. There are far better ways to build resilience that don't involve breaking down someone's soul and leaving us full of self-blame. And suffering, obviously, and any existentialist will tell you that, suffering can certainly be harnessed to learn from, but I don't think that anyone needs to suffer to become a fully formed person. This "it was good for you" model is often bandied about in situations in which a person experienced childhood narcissistic abuse from parents. And interestingly, especially, let's say you're doing well as an adult, you're succeeding in your job or in school, you'd hear things like, well, it couldn't have been that bad, you're doing just fine. I think that this definitely falls under gaslighting and feels like a gaslighting maneuver. There are many reasons a person may be just fine in adulthood despite having experienced narcissistic abuse, including still jumping through hoops in a futile attempt to try and win over that narcissistic parent, or having had to figure stuff out on your own to survive, which is very inefficient, but it's still, at the same time, still having to bear the burden of the skittishness, the vigilance, the confusion, the self-doubt, the trauma bonding that keeps you stuck in other relationships. Framing something that harmed you psychologically as being a good thing, it's not okay. You may have learned from it, but there were other ways to get those lessons. There is a prevailing wisdom out there that all childhoods were difficult, and having a narcissistic parent is just one version of a difficult childhood. Frankly, first of all, I don't believe that. And also, I don't think difficult childhoods do anyone any favors. Is any of it avoidable? Probably not. Narcissistic people will continue having children. The mental health system will continue not addressing it. And so unless a child is experiencing physical harm or what we consider reportable abuse, I'm confident these cycles won't end, and this cycle is actually why shrinks are going to be in business forever. Now, as we come out of the shock and awe of the holiday season, which is when we originally made this video, too much family time just unfolded for a lot of folks, and having to replicate and face down these family narcissistic cycles that you may have been able to deny for a good part of the rest of the year, you may have actually heard this sentiment from your family that, oh, don't bring up the bad stuff from the past, it was good for you. It's revisionist, and it is invalidating to hear this at any age. Listen, some of your parents may have rationalized it to themselves at the time. Sure, I'm hard on her, but it's good for her. Yeah, he went through a lot with his dad, but it made him the man he is. Yes, it did. And that is not a good thing. Narcissistic relationships, especially from parents, leave us with some tough scars that never fully heal. Challenges with close relationships, self-doubt that holds us back in careers, anxiety, underestimating and undervaluing ourselves, selling ourselves short. None of this is good. Yes, we may have become survivalists, but I'm not sure that that's a good thing. If someone does say this to you, it kind of goes back to that conventional wisdom I've shared on this YouTube channel in the past of, should I call a narcissistic person out? And my answer to that is always going to be a resounding no. So telling them, in the same vein, telling them that, like, no, what you did to me did not make me stronger or tougher. And just because other people go through this, or this is how it was in other generations, doesn't make it okay. It's frankly a meaningless discourse to get into with someone who's harmed you, and them trying to spin a feel-good story about how your adversity shaped you is part of their system of denial and rationalization. The fact is, they aren't listening to you anyhow, so having this conversation with them, pointless. Over the years, as I have worked with clients who got stronger, who became parents themselves, and think to themselves, oh God, what happened in my family of origin? I couldn't do this to my kids. But also sometimes found themselves falling into some of the toxic patterns of their parents. Parenting after you've experienced narcissistic abuse as a child can always feel like a battle zone. As I said, there will always be narcissistic parents, and there's no policy in the world that will change that. The best I can hope for is to get knowledge out there so folks early enough in their lives so they not only don't blame themselves for their parents' mistakes, but may be able to address them in a way that ends intergenerational cycles. I am personally witnessing a lot of folks who endured narcissistic abuse as children who are doing a really, really great job with their kids and ending these cycles. We may be able to learn and grow through suffering, but there's definitely a smoother path up that mountain that you didn't get to take. And someone trying to gloss over that painful path as being good for you, well, that's just straight up manipulation. I was recently talking to a group of people where there's a mix of folks, some who really went through it tough as kids and others didn't. And I was thinking to myself, like, the people, and I knew them well, and the people who had been through narcissistic abuse as kids in that group, I was thinking, like, if anyone ever said, pick the team you want to take into the jungle or the desert to survive with, no brainer. It was the survivors of narcissistic abuse. There was definitely an adaptability I saw there that the other folks, maybe a little bit too soft, wouldn't be able to do it. If you ever were to go in the fires of hell, I would definitely be really good at that. But that survivalist mindset can be a little tricky, because just as people who've been through this often do build up some really strong survivalist skills, the vigilance, the awareness, the figuring out all the exits, as it were, all the paths forward, that kind of heightened awareness also gets taken into life when it doesn't need to be so survivalist. And a lot of bandwidth goes to that. Don't tell me that was necessarily good for us. Okay, sure. Because most days I am not trying to survive in a hostile climate. I'm just trying to live my life. That survivalist mentality, not so sure that it necessarily is always doing me a favor, but give me a call if I'm ever stuck in the jungle. I'm sure it's going to do me just fine. Has anyone ever said to you about a narcissist in your life, they did their best? To me, enablers may actually cause more harm to us than the narcissists do. So let's break this down. This idea of they did their best is often the phrase enablers will use when describing a narcissistic parent. You're a narcissistic parent. Oh, come on now, they did their best. So the next part, which is usually unsaid, is, so you just have to put up and not question it and let it go. This concept of they did their best is also often employed in relationship situations. I know your partner was awful, but they did their best. And as with all enabling statements, it can negate your pain and your experience, because the assumption is that the harm rendered by the narcissistic person was not intentional. That is what this statement is about. A certain lack of intentionality. This idea, they did their best. They didn't mean to hurt you. They didn't set out to hurt you or invalidate you or gaslight you. They just did their best. Now, outside of the narcissistic space, this statement, this of you did your best or they did their best, is often a way we understand people who throw in a subpar or suboptimal performance in a variety of settings. For example, a child who does not do well on something at school, a person who couldn't finish a race, a person who tried but was not able to cook a meal. It's a way of saying, come on now, they gave it the old college try. They tried, and there's a nobility in trying, right? Well, it's one thing when this doing their best is an activity that doesn't involve harming someone else. For example, the kid who tried to do the book report but just wasn't able to understand the book. The person who struggles with health issues, so really tried to finish the race but couldn't quite get there. The person who can't boil water and burned the dinner. I guess they did they did their best. But in these circumstances, their not succeeding didn't really hurt anyone. It's the use of this statement, they did their best, in interpersonally painful, toxic, or antagonistic circumstances that's the problem. That a person tried their best, even as people were harmed, invalidates the experience, pain, and hurt of the person who was impacted by the bad behavior. For example, a parent who judges, criticizes, minimizes, gaslights, and manipulates a child throughout their childhood, and then mix that in with a little bit of neglect and lack of empathy. For that child to grow into adulthood, and then in adulthood struggle with not feeling good enough, a sense of self-doubt. For people to come rolling in and say, and look at their parent, this adult now, you're now an adult, look at your parent and say, they did their best. What's the point? What's the point of saying that? Now, the paradox of the enabler is that there are all different kinds, and we're going to have a series on all the different kinds of enablers. Now, basically, the enabler has a worldview that they like, and they don't want to shift it or be open to other perspectives. So perhaps they have a need to see the world in a certain way, and they can't integrate the idea that someone is not a good parent or was frankly a bad one. And so it's easier to say, come on now, they tried their best. Or maybe the enabler themselves isn't such a great parent and is projecting their own fears and neuroses into your own story. They really need to back away and stay the hell out of your story. This is such a common enabling statement that most people fall for it. Most people who have had a narcissistic or antagonistic or otherwise difficult parent can look back and say, I actually do get why my parent or parents struggled as parents. So on top of their parent having a difficult personality, many adult survivors of narcissistic abuse are also able to see that the family had financial struggles, or their parents were just too young, or their parents had their own difficult parents, or the parent had a difficult backstory around immigration or discrimination or other societal issues that cause stress and shame. Or it was the time or the generation, and it was a time when, for example, emotion was devalued. The cognitive dissonance of having a narcissistic parent is such that people can justify and rationalize. So when an enabler rolls up and said, they just did their best, it's easy to just fall into that and even blame yourself for being angry at something your parents are continuing to do or say to you. Now, here is the struggle, especially when someone says to you that your difficult, narcissistic, manipulative parent did their best. It is to make peace with something, that something is difficult, to just reconcile with this idea. Their best simply wasn't okay. It just wasn't. They screwed up, and you get to carry the legacy of that screw up. Perhaps they weren't fully up to the job. Most people aren't up to the job of being parents. No parent or person is perfect. Nobody is even close. But they're screwing it up, and there is screwing it up. There does come a point where you need to put it down so you don't have to live in anger. Not to deny it. And you do need to grieve what happened to you. The most difficult part of having had a narcissistic parent is to go through the pain and the hurt of grieving your own childhood. Many people get stuck in the loop of regret and resentment. They wonder, how different would I have been if someone had just encouraged me? If I had heard just a few good things about me instead of constant criticism? If I didn't walk on eggshells for the first 18 years of my life or longer? If I'd witnessed actual happiness between my parents? Or if I'd actually been noticed by them? Grief after narcissistic abuse is a process, and it's messy and it's painful, but it is a process. And at some point, I promise you, you just got to do the work. You can get to the other side and put it down. Narcissists get heavy to carry around for a long time. Now, sadly, the enabler is partially right. The narcissist probably did do their best, and thus is the tragedy of these high conflict personality styles like narcissism. They are limited and they are limiting. The people who possess them are stuck in an immature, rigid personality that cannot do the heavy lifting on psychically demanding roles like parenting. And to recognize that the slings and arrows and wounds, all these things that happen to you, they are what made you. Let's face it, the most interesting people in the room are the ones who have actually been through something. It's okay to say that their best wasn't good enough yet. The goal is to not let that define you. And you then decide what works in that relationship. Boundaries, no contact, disengagement, superficial engagement. It's different for everyone. Just don't keep throwing yourself under the bus with them. There is a point where we do sling the backpacks of our legacies and our lives on our backs. And some people have much heavier backpacks than others. But all of us have to move forward. It's not easy, but I promise you it can be done, and I see people doing it every day. Find your audiences. The enablers are often so afraid of the world, afraid when things don't fit their worldview, that they have no problem forcing their version of events on others so as to make it all fit. The key is to remember, you don't need to listen to them. And recognize that when people are hurt, when you're feeling hurt, hearing that someone did their best is very little solace. It's a common statement for enablers to fall back on. And when you hear this stuff, find an excuse and step out of the room. You don't get into a debate. You don't try to convince the enabler of a different path. Recognize that they want to keep their rose-colored glasses on, and you will not be the one to get them to take them off. All's fair in love and war. Okay, so let's reflect on this one. All's fair in love and war. Is it? This proverb has its origins, I think, in a poem from the 1500s, so it's been around a while. Actually kind of excuses bad behavior in romantic relationships. And narcissistic folks, oh boy, do they ever run with the ball of this old proverby wisdom. When something like this proverb that is so embedded in our thinking about love and war is in line with other stupid sayings like love makes people crazy, so then they do stupid things and make the crazy as a defense. No! That all of these kinds of proverbs and things like that can leave people feeling like these relationships are the wild, wild west, so everything is permissible in these relationships because it's love. Well, let me tell you this. Narcissistic people are notoriously unfair in relationships. They cheat, they lie, they often do a bait and switch, they manipulate, they blame you for things that you are not responsible for. So, these relationships, by definition, are not fair. The love bombing can make these relationships feel like passionate love affairs, and it's easy to fall into the morass of all's fair in love because the entire thing feels like a massive roller coaster. It really is amazing how many of these proverbs are really just enabling and excuse narcissistic behavior. It almost seems like it's 50-50. Now, war is a different story, right? By definition, war often is not fair, but even so, there are many things that can happen in a way that really aren't fair, right? Like attacking and harming civilians. And since most people who love war are narcissistic, you can pretty much bet that war obviously isn't fair either. But so why is it? Why is it so difficult for narcissistic people to play fair? Forget love and war. Even in day-to-day life, they can't. And their entitlement is a part of it. Rules are a headache for them. And it really frustrates them when they have to follow rules. Antagonistic people are oppositional, so rules don't work for them, and they cannot play fair. They cheat at everything. Taxes, work, business, relationships, whatever matters to them. But unfortunately, this mentality that if something matters and there's strong emotion involved, then the passion means that sometimes it's not fair. Love and war, right? I have talked with many survivors of narcissistic abuse who, in the anger and rage and frustration, and above all the injustice, will say to the narcissist about whatever happened, "It's not fair." And in all cases, they said that the narcissistic person fired back with, "Life's not fair." I could almost buy that as an answer, except for the fact that the narcissists out there have a hypocrisy about fairness. They expect it for themselves, but do not feel that it should be granted to anyone else or that they don't deserve it. So back to the all's fair in love bit. They may use that as a defense for their behavior, but for any reason you were unfair to them in love, forget about it. With the vindictiveness that would follow, let me tell you, it would feel like war. And once again, all's fair in war to them probably as well. All's not fair in love. It just isn't. It's not fair to invalidate someone or cheat on someone or lie to someone or silence someone's spirit or gaslight them or future fake them or minimize them. It's not. But according to this proverb, if all's fair in love, then that sort of feels like a sign-off on this behavior. Again, we too often view the passion and the emotion and the fervor of love as a place where rules don't apply, but they actually do. Healthy, well-regulated people behave fairly in love, no matter how passionate it is. The fates and the vagaries of life, a storm that can wipe away a house, an illness that takes a young person's life, wealth inequality, a person being born to a narcissistic parent. All of those are pretty damn good examples of life being unfair. But a person who chooses not to regulate themselves and who is entitled and arrogant and narcissistically abusing someone, to me, that doesn't fall under what's all's fair in love. That falls under emotional abuse. It's a choice, and it's not just unfair, it's wrong. We give too much of a free pass to the behavior that happens within a close relationship. The idea that all relationships are oh so different and we can't really know what's happening in a relationship because we aren't in it, and there are so many different kinds of relationships. I'm not buying that nonsense. There is a healthy way a relationship can be, and there is an unhealthy way. So no, all is not fair in love. And this proverb has been misused so many times for people who will say, "Oh, golly, poor her relationship ended, all's fair in love and war, I guess." No, it's not. Healthy people have healthy rules, communication, boundaries, respect, mutuality, and compassion in their relationships. That's all being fair in love. Anything different than that? Not so much. So anyone who's ever survived a long-term narcissistic relationship knows more about endurance than any extreme athlete. Because the fact is, narcissistic relationships in some ways are like one of those 100-mile marathons. The people in them get sick. They kind of sometimes even hallucinate and lose their grip with reality. Their bodies kind of get destroyed, but there's a sort of toughness they experience, right? Because if you ran 100 miles, you endured it. It's tough, right? Endurance, though, is the name of the game in a narcissistic relationship. And this is not, narcissistic relationships aren't about being sprinters. This is about being able to, in the long term, endure the confusion, inconsistency, gaslighting, manipulation, selfishness, entitlement, and invalidation of a relationship that more days than not leaves you feeling worse about yourself. After a while, you are so focused on getting through the day that it is easy to lose sight of how damaging this relationship is. But people who are in narcissistic relationships grow accustomed to putting their heads down, losing themselves, and almost proving something to themselves by getting through another day. It just becomes an act of sheer will, like probably running that 86th mile in that 100-mile race. So here is where this endurance dynamic gets to be kind of gross. When you get praised for enduring, either by the narcissistic person themselves or by another person, what may happen is that you are told that you're doing great because you put up with their BS, or because you don't let them get under your skin, or you're even rewarded. Oh gosh, you're so easy. You're able to make all these relationships work. You're being congratulated for giving up on yourself and not questioning the toxicity of this relationship to other people. You may be, but not outside. Sadly, we often offer up high praise to people who quietly put up with narcissistic or other kinds of toxic relationships. Oh, she's a saint, isn't she? Isn't he cool? He just goes with the flow. You know, they don't let stuff get to them. Aren't they just wonderful? Maybe, but maybe not. They may be wonderful. I'm sure they are. But offering up praise for enduring toxic relationship behavior sets a really bad precedent and can often leave that person feeling unseen. And survivors of narcissistic abuse experience this all the time. It's basically the grown-up equivalent of saying, isn't she just such a good girl? Because she's sitting there so quiet and well-behaved and not asking for any of her needs to be met. But what the child is often doing is morphing into what the parents demand of her. Who knows how that good girl is, because nobody's finding out. She's not expressing anything she needs anyhow. In the same manner, we reward adults who do this in their relationships. This sort of rewarded endurance is something I have a real problem with. I have said to many clients over the years, oh my goodness, you've endured so much, meaning that you've been through so much. But for me, it's not okay to say, well, look at how well you're enduring this. There is no well with regard to having to navigate narcissistic behavior on the daily. I know that for many people, the big question is, how do I stay in one of these relationships? I can't leave. I'm not ready to leave. I'm afraid to leave. So how do I stay? Yeah, many people stay, and you need to figure out workarounds. But a silent, soul-killing endurance in the long term isn't going to work. Because to do that means that you still aren't allowing yourself to exist in terms of your identity and your sense of self separate from them. And the fact is, they don't want you to do that. Staying is about thousands of things you do. Foster other social ties, perhaps being in therapy, finding support, finding your voice, doing things that give you meaning and purpose, and disengaging from the narcissistic person as much as you can. But it's not about capitulating and surrender and enduring the suffering stoically. The narcissistic people and their enablers, and frankly society at large, may want to give you applause for being a quiet and patient sufferer and endurer. But please know that healing means giving yourself permission to find 1,000 small ways to rebel in these relationships every day. For my lazy self, running a 100-mile race really doesn't make sense. And enduring a toxic relationship doesn't either. So keep that in mind, that think of all of us as kids, especially for girls and women. What a good girl you are. You sat there, you asked for nothing, and we praise that. And we do it for adults. There are no prizes for endurance. So there are people out there who put up with these narcissistic relationships for a lifetime. And we will often want to martyr them, but I think all we really need to do is empathize with them. So let's talk about this, because we love lifers. We love people who say they've been married for 65 years, or they're showing up at their gazillionth annual family reunion, or have some family tradition that they engage in faithfully every single year. And we're like, ooh, that person's so solid. Listen, if a person's been married for 65 happy years, or that family reunion is joyful and respectful, or those traditions are happy and good, then I love that for you. I really do. I'm actually a little bit jealous of that too. And great, wonderful, and healthy. But we think long-term anything is virtuous. We'll say things like, ooh, she stuck it out no matter how hard it got, or he was always by their side. And listen, with younger folks, this is the generation that's taking on this idea of long-term jobs in a different way. But there's always been this sort of apocryphal 40 years in the gold watch, staying in a toxic go-nowhere job. But good for you. The fact is, good for you young folks who aren't doing that anymore and being more flexible. But we really do still look at the people who stick stuff out, family relationships, marriages, work things, as somehow good. But it's not good if it's not healthy. And this martyring or glorifying the sticking out of a bad situation is something that can really get people stuck. It contributes to the confusing messages that people get about what to do when they are in unhealthy relationships. There's so much guilt and confusion and self-blame that people do not know what to do. And then when you throw into the mix that the idea of how virtuous someone was, look how virtuous they are because they made the best out of a bad situation, well, you can definitely see how this could leave a person who's sort of teetering in a toxic relationship to say, well, I'm a good person, and maybe good people just stick out bad situations. Now, sadly, the societal messages that people get from religion, culture, intergenerational messages is basically to put up and shut up. It's almost in our sort of relational DNA. And even now, in 2023, I am still struck by the number of folks out there that will chide and criticize people for divorce, even when it happened under the worst of circumstances, or that will shame people who may become estranged from impossible family situations, or who may quit jobs before they have new ones because their job that they were in was so twisted. This all or nothing mindset, and on top of that, the overvaluing the folks of people who stay in something, is not good for any of us. And before you yammer on to me about the effects of divorce on kids, I gotta tell you, for a kid, watching parents in a contentious marriage may mess up a kid even more. It's really about picking your poison at that point. But we get so focused on these relationship ultra-marathoners that we forget to give people the most important tools of all, which are discernment and gatekeeping. To learn from the very beginning that it's okay to step back when things feel uncomfortable, and what uncomfortable actually is, and that rationalizing abuse just because it's family can mean lifelong cycles that hold you back. We don't teach people that, but we do cram you full of old tales about how great someone was because they were married for 200 years or were loyal to some dysfunctional family business. And here is where it gets interesting, and really what propelled me to make this video. I have had the opportunity to talk with these martyred, long-term, ultra-marathoner, narcissistic relationship people, and most of them aren't happy about it. Many will acknowledge the cultural pressures or financial pressures or even the safety ones that kept them stuck. And in some cases, it was medical issues or healthcare costs. They didn't stay out of love or devotion or anything like that. It was pure survival. And for some of them, they took some real hits in the hope that maybe they could make it better for a future generation. But a lot of these long-term survivors that we want to martyr aren't walking around saying, hey, look how virtuous I am. I am saint, stick it out. No, they don't. Their healing and survival may have come from trying to contextualize what they were experiencing. Most survivors of narcissistic abuse, though, are living in a broken world. Family courts that don't work, expensive housing markets, stupidly expensive healthcare, culturally antiquated notions about family and relationships, and a lack of support. And they have to make decisions to keep themselves alive or safe, or other people alive or safe. People who often stayed in these relationships for a long time, they didn't want it to be that way. And they were very clear that it's their hope that in future generations, that people will have the freedom to go and leave when things get unhealthy. They are the living information that these situations, these narcissistic relationships, do not get better with time. The narcissistic folks may get more oppositional and more demanding, and as the long-term folks stick it out and the survivors get older, the survivors may also no longer have the physical capacity to start again. We can learn from these folks, but instead of treating them as virtuous martyrs, perhaps to simply see them as teachers. So here's where it gets interesting, and really what propelled me to want to make this video. I've actually had the opportunity to talk to a lot of these sort of martyred ultramarathoners, long-term survivors of narcissistic relationship, and most of them aren't happy about it. Many will acknowledge the cultural pressures or financial pressures or even the safety ones that kept them stuck. In some cases, it was medical issues or healthcare issues. They hadn't stayed out of love or anything else. It was pure survival. And for some of them, they took some real hits in the hope that their life ultimately may make it better for a future generation. They certainly aren't walking around saying, look how virtuous I am, I stayed in this relationship, or to say, I'm saint, stick it out. No, they didn't. Their healing and survival may have come from them trying to contextualize what they experienced. Most survivors of narcissistic abuse are living in a broken world. Family courts that don't work, expensive housing markets, stupidly expensive health care, culturally antiquated notions of marriage and family, and a lack of support. And they have to make decisions to keep themselves alive or safe, or other people alive or safe. They didn't want it to be that way. And these folks I talked to were very clear that it's their hope that in future generations, the next generation will have the freedom, people will have the freedom to go and leave relationships when things get unhealthy, to be able to set boundaries. These people are the living information that narcissistic relationships don't get better with time. The narcissistic folks tend to get more oppositional and demanding. And as those long-term stick-it-out folks, those survivors get older, they may also no longer have the physical capacity to start again. We can learn from these folks. And instead of treating people who stay in unhealthy relationships as virtuous martyrs, we can see them as teachers. Listen, as someone who has personally benefited from the sacrifices of many prior generations, some of whom have experienced narcissistic abuse, I see the lifelong sadness that has come to people who had stayed. And I never, ever underestimate the freedoms that their lives ultimately gave me. They never wanted to be glorified or viewed as martyrs, but instead they took the stance that yes, us in a prior generation couldn't do things, but please don't let our lives be in vain. Go, be freer, give yourself permission to make the healthier choices. It's very easy to romanticize the idea that someone just stuck it out, and aren't they so great? Not necessarily. Instead of glorifying the stick it out, let's recognize the sacrifices that some of these folks made, the limitations that they faced. But let's not ever try to view suffering and abuse through an idealized lens. We've got to break out of these old ways of viewing things. And that, again, there's a lot to learn there, that these are people who did have to tough it out. But trust me when I tell you, they don't want to be viewed as martyrs, but they do want you to learn from the long-term toxic relationships that they had to put up with. Thanks again.